This is American Government, Friday, August 21st, 2020. Let me tell you where we are and what we're going to be doing in the next couple of days. We're beginning the study of the core principles of the American Constitution in the larger sense that I explained it in my lecture on Wednesday, the regime, the whole political system. Remember, the four parts of a political system or a constitution, written or unwritten, are core principles or shared beliefs about human nature and justice, governing institutions, the actions of the institutions, passing laws and policies, and finally the kind of human beings and the way of life they live that are shaped by virtue of living in that political community. Now, as I said, not every country has a written constitution, but we do. And it turns out, of course, that would mean that in that schema of a regime, or the four parts of a regime, the written constitution, or what we call the Constitution, would occupy that second layer of institutions. Now, of course, in terms of the first and the principled or the shared beliefs, there it turns out we have another document that contains and explains those and goes back to the beginning of the nation. In fact, the adoption of that document at around 2 or 3 in the morning on July 4th, 1776, which is why we call it Independence Day. And I'll talk about that in the historical sketch leading up to the Declaration, if you're looking at the notes. That's why we consider that document to be authoritative and actually the beginning of the country. It states our core beliefs. Now, here's how I'm going to approach this document. So today, by the way, the readings were the first part of Wilson, Chapter 2 on the Revolution and the Founding, the Declaration of Independence, and the preparation and review questions, at least the first few that I mentioned there. We'll turn to the other ones in the next couple of days. And I also sent out a blank outline of the Declaration, which I'll go through today. And also a selection from Federalist 31 by Alexander Hamilton. We're going to talk a lot about the Federalist Papers. You're going to read quite a few of them in this class. Just by way of explanation, those were the 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay between late 17... Between, that was my Cortana on my phone speaking for some reason. I have no idea why she woke up. Go back to sleep. From 1787 to 1788, as we're going to see when we turn to the history of the structure, of the construction of the Constitution, that's the founding period. That's the ratification period of the United States Constitution. And James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were members of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 when the Constitution was drafted, and also collaborated on these 85 newspaper essays that were published during the months of the ratification struggle in New York to help persuade, especially the people of New York, but they were quickly bound and circulated throughout the colonies, I should say the states at that time, because their brilliance and critical importance were recognized even then. They have remained, by the way, something like an authoritative commentary on the Constitution. And so, for instance, if you followed the impeachment proceedings of President Clinton all the way from last fall when the House debated and then drew up articles of impeachment in December, and then the Senate trial that occurred in January, everyone on both sides was constantly referring to the Federalist Papers. Now, this particular Federalist Papers, 31, its content is not important. Hamilton is defending the idea that a national government should have the power to tax equal to its needs. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the defects of the articles and how the Constitution was created to supplant those or address those. But the particular reason I asked you to look at this selection, and it's not an easy selection to read, maybe because the language of the Federalist Papers is almost scholarly, although that's how newspaper editorials read in those days. But in particular, it's one of the almost the single contemporaneous important discussions of a term that you will learn is central to the Declaration of Independence: self-evident truths. What does that mean when a truth is self-evident? Hamilton tries to explain that. We'll come back to that. And you'll see why that's so important, because once you grasp that term and why that's in the Declaration, then you will see that it raises a critical and controversial issue that Americans still debate about. And that is whether the Declaration of Independence is a religious or even a Christian document. We'll talk about that. Now, our general procedure in trying to understand the Declaration and what it teaches and its importance in our life will be, imagine again that we're starting from the outside, from the exterior. And of course, in this case, the exterior would be the historical circumstances and political circumstances that led to the creation of and adoption of the Declaration of Independence. So the first part of today's lecture is going to be a little historical sketch. This is not a history class, and yet there are two times when I'm going to lay in front of you a brief historical sketch, and I'll expect you to know some historical dates. Yes, you will be tested on that. That always gets students' attention. You will be tested on this, and you will. Anyway, so you might want to back away from the screen a little bit. But the second one is when we turn to the Constitution. Now, if you look on the notes, I've asterisked or starred those dates that you're going to have to know. Again, it's not because I have a power control, and this is the only way I can make people's lives miserable, besides giving them C minuses. I'm just kidding. These dates are important for understanding the sequence of events and the historical context of the Declaration and the Constitution. So starting from the outside, the historical circumstances, we'll look at the document and get a sense of its overall content and structure, its outline. Outlines tend to be so foreign to college students today because they're often never taught how to do them, but an outline is like the internal structure of a document, and I think you can learn a lot from it. And then we'll turn to the last thing today, which will probably be the entire 15 minutes of the lecture, is this interesting term, self-evident truth, because it points to a critical question regarding the Declaration. And in the preparation and review questions, this is the question that I list as, what's the basis of authority or the source of authority? And just to make you explain it, and we'll come back to that, I'm not saying where the authority to write the Declaration or adopt it as a national document comes from. That's understood to be the people. And that's one of the principles in the second paragraph. It's called consent. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what standard of authority makes the principles, the truth claims of the Declaration true. Like, for instance, that all men are created equal, that human equality. What makes that true? Because certainly in 1776, it was not a self-evident truth to most of humanity that human beings were politically or naturally equal to each other, or that they had rights, or the other 5 core principles of the second paragraph of the Declaration. So what's the standard of authority? And just to prep you for what's coming on Monday and Wednesday. So we'll start from the outside, historical circumstances, the structure and language of the document, and then we'll move inward to its core teachings. And you'll see the Declaration is in some ways a short document. It's a political document. It's a party document, the American Independence Party document, so to speak. But it's also a philosophical statement about humanity and the human condition and the nature and purpose of politics. It's a tiny little philosophic tract. And it contains 3 core teachings. One, interestingly enough, about nature. And I'm going to argue that the basis of authority, or what makes the Declaration's claims about human beings and human government true, is it rests its authority on nature. That's a controversial and a profound topic. We'll come back to that on Monday. The second deep teaching, core teaching of the Declaration is a doctrine about human nature. And then the third one is it's a political theory, a political philosophy treatise on the nature, origin, and purposes of government. Nature, human nature, government. Those are the 3 fundamental teachings, core teachings in the Declaration. And then on Wednesday, we'll then we'll see what the core teaching of the Declaration is, and then on Wednesday we'll look to what I would call commentaries on or reverberations of the Declaration, and there are 4 of them, by the way. One is a selection from Abraham Lincoln. This will be for next Wednesday, from the debates between Stephen Douglas and him, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858 and 57 in Illinois, when they were both running for Senate of Illinois, before, of course, 1860, when they both ran for president. Then we'll turn to a commentary on the Declaration by a professor of mine, Martin Diamond. I'll talk more about him, who wrote a commentary on what the Declaration's principles mean, especially the principle of liberty. So you could say that Lincoln and Douglas are debating the principle of equality, one of the Declaration's core teachings, and it wouldn't be an accident that they were talking about equality, because, of course, the issue was the relative presence of slavery, or the relationship of slavery between the Declaration of Independence and the place of slavery in American life. Diamond is talking about the other core idea in terms of human nature, and that's rights or freedom, what liberty means in the Declaration. Then we'll see the second inaugural of Barack Obama, who talks about the relevance of the Declaration to ongoing American political life. And then we'll read a short story by Kurt Vonnegut, a great science fiction master in short stories called Harrison Bergeron, who explores the tensions between the principle of liberty and equality. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next couple of lectures. Starting from the outside of the Declaration, we'll see how it was written and how it's structured in its language. Then we'll turn to its inner, most important teachings, and then we'll look back outwards towards how the Declaration is interpreted, applied, and how it reverberates through American political life. So if you're looking at the notes, let's do our historical sketch. Again, I quote extensively from texts accompanying some of these dates. I'm not going to read all of those, but some of them. What I want you to take away from this, this is not a comprehensive history of the colonial period or even the Revolutionary period. It is, in some ways, to get a frame of reference for the core dates, because I've been astounded at times how little of American history American students know. I'm not accusing you of being ignorant, but it's true that the teaching of American history, or world history for that matter, it hasn't evaporated in our public and secondary schools. But here's a sober fact: only 19% of American colleges and universities require any kind of history class. So the unfortunate thing is, it's possible to get a 4-year degree in an American institution of higher learning, knowing as little history as when you come out as when you went in, which is, I think, a really bad thing. It's a travesty. So you're going to learn a little history here so that you understand the formation and the events that led up to the Declaration. So if you're looking, the first, I'm not starring this, the first 2 are kind of controversial, uncontroversial. Really, the first English settlements in America were in 1609, the Jamestown Settlement. Now, it didn't succeed eventually, but nevertheless, it was technically the first colony here, and it was a commercial colony, and it had a commercial charter. You're going to see that the different colonies had different kind of charters. And I'm going to argue that even though 1609 and then the next date has become very controversial, because as we'll see later when we look at the place of slavery and race in the founding, in 1619 about 20 indentured servants, some African slaves, were introduced to Virginia, and the New York Times instituted what it called its 1619 Project to claim that that's the true founding of the country, and that and as you'll see, the reasons for that and what supports that claim, and we'll look more at that whole historical debate later on. Now, the first asterisk date is 1620, and that's the Plymouth, the Mayflower, the Pilgrims. When the Pilgrims came, the Pilgrims were a Protestant group, and you're going to see if the colonial period is the embryonic period of American life that culminates in the birth of America in 1776, which is not a bad analogy, then it's critical to understand how we emerged as a nation when you understand that the core political and cultural background of our nation was the Protestant Reformation. for all kinds of reasons. Here's just a small one, by the way. Americans, during the time of the Revolution and the formation of the Constitution from 1776 to 1790, the colonial and immediate revolutionary and constitutional period of the American regime, Americans had one of the highest rates of literacy in the world. And therefore, more than any other political founding in the history of humanity, both the Declaration and the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation for that matter, were widely read and discussed by certainly a plurality, and of course discussed by a majority of Americans, because really most Americans could read at that time. Why was that unusual? That was a very unusual thing for any national population. Going back to antiquity, when only the Jews and the Greeks generally taught their young people how to read, because reading was not a necessity for complex civilized life, and it was tended to be an elite activity until in 1517, when Luther and Calvin instituted the Protestant Revolution, and then 1536, when John Calvin, in Switzerland, published the Institutes of the Christian Religion and started the Protestant Reformation. Remember, the Protestant Reformation was a rejection of Catholicism and priestly authority, and instead, to create the individual experience of faith, the Protestants argued that every Christian should be able to read. And out of that religious Reformation came the impulse that the great body of a people should be able to read. Now, that was picked up by the secular Enlightenment that followed, and in which our country is in some ways part of the phenomenon of. So, American literacy probably comes and derives from its Protestant Christian foundations. But at any rate, there's another interesting aspect of the founding of the colony in Massachusetts at Plymouth Rock. And I could sing for you. Typically, I do at this point. I sing Cole Porter's "Anything Goes," which has a wonderful preface. I'm not going to sing it now. You're just too young and impressionable. Times have changed, and we often rewound the clock since the Puritans got a shock when they landed on Plymouth Rock. If today any rock they should try to stem, instead of landing on Plymouth Rock would land on them. There you go. Anything goes. All right, look it up. But the other interesting thing about the Plymouth colony, aside from that it generated the first Thanksgiving, etc., which most of you know, is the Mayflower Compact. The members of the Mayflower, of the three ships that came over and the Mayflower, the members during the ocean voyage, they formulated an agreement, a compact upon which to build the political community that they were founding. And I'll just read a bit of it. "In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign lord, King James, by grace of God, of Great Britain, France and Ireland King, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in northern parts." And then they discuss about how they'll try to form the community and its basis. Why is this important? Because I'm going to argue, as I suggested, by the way, in Wednesday's lecture, that the American Constitution was the first true written constitution in human history. And I argue, when I teach American political thought and American constitutional history, that this American tendency to try to encapsulate the foundations of political life in a written document probably derives from this origin of the Massachusetts colony. And from this idea of the compact, the idea that political society begins when its members come together and form a compact or a covenant or agreement and consent to live under it, that reverberates through all of American history, and many of the other colonial charters imitated this. And of course, once independence was reached and the Declaration became the kind of foundation of American principal beliefs, all of the colonial governments, when they became state governments, adopted written constitutions. Then, as a nation, we tried our first written constitution in the Articles of Confederation, which we'll talk about more later on, and then, of course, the written constitution. So the idea of a written constitution, a core American belief that is one of our major contributions to political culture, I believe derives from this seminal moment in 1620, the Mayflower Compact. Now, the colonies grew and everything, and as for slavery, we'll come back to this, but even de Tocqueville in 1831, in his the great French aristocrat's analysis of America and democracy in America, his great massive volume, which he wrote after visiting this country in 9 months in 1831. Even he argued that America was really two kind of different cultures, the North and the South. Um, and and even he attributed the differences between the political culture and social arrangements in the North and the political and cultural South in the South to the presence of slavery for complex reasons we'll see later. But let's jump ahead now to the 1700s, and you'll see that the Revolutionary period, that is to say, the point at which the sentiment of the British colonists in America coagulated around the idea that we should separate from Great Britain and become a separate nation, really began. I have a date. I'm going to mention it. I'm not going to have you remember it, but it leads to the first true beginning of the Revolutionary struggle. That date, by the way, is 1754, the French and Indian War. In North America, the French and the English contested for colonial predominance. And in 1754, the French imperial regime enlisted the aid of many of the Indian tribes over the Appalachians in what's now Ohio and Indiana and eastern or western Pennsylvania, etc., Kentucky, to wage war on the British colonists. Interestingly enough, a young Virginian officer, George Washington, had his first command experience, and it was disastrous, by the way. He under his command, most of his men were killed in a raid, and it was the most formative influence in his life, from which he reacted and shaped the rest of his life, even into the end of his presidency. But at any rate, the British government, of course, the Crown, and waged war not only to the importation of British soldiers, but also enlisted colonials in that struggle. Now, the reason that's important is later on, to pay for the war, Parliament and the Crown passed a series of taxation acts. The first one in 1765, and this is an important date, was the Stamp Act, to raise money to pay for the war that Britain fought in order to hold on to its colonial possessions in North America. Now, as you're going to see, the colonists did not object to paying taxes. All government requires taxes, unfortunately or fortunately. They reacted to the idea that Parliament would impose taxation on them without representation. Now, if you think for a minute, and by the way, you can read the Tax Act, and what the Stamp Act meant was it was a tax on newspapers and publications and periodicals because the American population was so literate, they loved their magazines and newspapers. People magazine, not quite. And by the way, Benjamin Franklin started one of the first weekly magazines on the Saturday Evening Post. So, although it's no longer published, but it went up to, I think, the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s. But at any rate, so the Stamp Act imposed, so to publish something, you had to buy a stamp and pay the tax and put the stamp on the publication. And Americans began to resent that. And it is that act that leads, and if you're looking at the subsidiary dates right after that, they began to resist the tax. And the British government responded by sending more troops. And in 1765, they began to station British soldiers in private homes called the quartering of troops, which was so unpopular that it was not only mentioned only in the Declaration of Independence, it became the Third Amendment to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights. And then in 1766, the relations began to get worse. And in the Declaratory Act, Parliament passed an act declaring the colonies in rebellion and authorizing the Crown to take punitive steps. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party, where colonials dumped the tea from a major shipment of tea in the Boston Harbor. And then in 1774, the Intolerable Acts. This is a colonial designation. Now, the next set of dates are asterisk because these are important. By this time, 1774, 1775, the struggle with the British Crown and the British Parliament and the colonial administration becomes so intense that it breaks out in combat. Now, it's interesting. It doesn't do that until, interestingly enough, an important development happens in 1774. The first Continental Congress, which met on September 5th. Why is this date important? Because this was the first institutional expression of a continental sense of identity, corresponding in modern European history to the formation of the European Union, where Americans first came together institutionally to try to address the issues leading to the conflict with Britain. So note, by the way, that that and the purpose of that, by the way, the purpose of the First Continental Congress was not independence. It was reconciliation. It was considered that if the colonists could speak with a single voice, that the Crown and the Parliament would negotiate more seriously. Of course, it didn't work. And then the next date, 1775, Lexington and Concord, begins the War of Independence. And you may remember Paul Revere, who wrote, and if the British are coming with one light or two, and so forth. The war actually begins, the Revolutionary War begins in 1775 on April 19th. Now, that's important then, because the Second Continental Congress then is formed in response to the beginning of the war. And that means the function of the institutional expression of the colonies in the Continental Congress begins to change. It's no longer just a body to represent the colonists in negotiations with the Crown and the Parliament. It now becomes an institution that begins to direct the war effort. And as you're going to see, this is the institution, the Second Continental Congress, that adopts the Declaration of Independence, and therefore the Second Continental Congress is really the birth institution of the American nation. Now, I'm not asking you to remember this day, but as the war went on, another important thing happened. Not only did the war and the loss of American blood and the threat of British and the fear of British colonial reprisals and measures led to a kind of a common sense, as it often does, by the way, a common sense of grievance. But another important thing begins to happen, and that's the ideas that are embodied in the Declaration begin to circulate within the American population and begin to grow, get a hold on the American mind. An American mind, different from a British mind. Wilson in Chapter 2 says that the rights that the Americans were first fighting for were English, British traditional rights. And that's true, because at the beginning of this struggle with the First Continental Congress, the colonists did not cease to think of themselves as Britons. And therefore, they were petitioning their rulers to restore traditional British rights. But an important ideological change, an important ideational change occurred. And there is a seminal date and a seminal event and a seminal important publication, and that is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Thomas Paine was an interesting individual. He was English. He came to this country, became radicalized. He became discontented with the American leadership, and eventually moved to France after the Revolution, and became quite critical of the America that emerged out of the Revolution. But nevertheless, on January 10th, he published a little pamphlet. And there have been several major bestsellers in American life. You may know, for instance, the best-selling book of all time in America is the Bible. And then right behind it are a couple other interesting publications. Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1853 was one of the major bestsellers in American history. Ben Franklin's Autobiography, dull and boring because I've taught it several times to college students, yet that was a big bestseller. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a Christian tract, that part of the Great Awakening. But Common Sense was an amazing bestseller. Within a few months, it sold over 300,000 copies, all up and down the continent. And in some ways, let's look at the last paragraph of the selection. Paine was a great writer. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a country, a city, or a province or a kingdom, but of a continent, at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in this contest, and will be more or less affected even until the end of time. What an amazing thing. Yet this document, which, as you're going to see, contained the ideas of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and other modern political philosophers, that's when the idea of inherent natural rights, not British rights, but inherent natural rights, began to circulate for revolutionary reasons that we'll see. And so, in some ways, this is the critical background to the events that occurred in the summer of 1776. By the end of May, the sentiment for independence was beginning to coagulate. And so it was considered that probably the resolution for independence should come from a major state in terms of territory, wealth, and population. And that was, of course, there were a few contenders, primarily, as we'll see later on in the construction of the Constitution, the two most important states in the Union in terms of population centrality, geography, and commerce were New York and Virginia. So Richard Henry Lee, yes, the progenitor of several generations of Lees, including, by the way, Robert E. Lee, subsequently the American general who became the leader, the commander-in-chief of Confederate forces. Richard Henry Lee brought back from Williamsburg in Virginia, the state capital then, this resolution. You should remember this date. So now the dates get very compact because we're talking about 1 month. This is literally the last month of the pregnancy of the colonies, leading to the birth of America. So you'll see there are 3 parts of this resolution. I'll read it, and you'll see that in some ways each aspect of this, at least the first 2 parts of the resolution, survive in the Declaration. So the Declaration of Independence is like an expanded version of this resolution for independence. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. That it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances. That a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. So, resolved that we should separate from Britain. Second, that we should form alliances. And third, that we should create a continental plan of confederation. Now, of course, the third part of that is what became the Articles of Confederation, and this Continental Congress did act on that, but much later than the events of independence. So the resolution says that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, independent states, and that all connection between the British government and the colonies should be dissolved, and that foreign alliances should be contracted. Each one of those elements survive in the Declaration and become expanded into a national charter, so to speak. Okay, so the Continental Congress then did what all major deliberative plural bodies do. They create a committee to draft up the causes of the separation and a convenient declaration of those causes. The members of that 5-person committee were Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Roger Sherman. And they in turn delegated the writing of the Declaration, the drafting of it, to Thomas Jefferson, a young man, but already acquiring a reputation for eloquence and composition. For 3 weeks, he struggled on a draft. He submitted to the committee. The committee made some major changes in it, and then it was submitted then to the Congress. Now, it's interesting. There could have been 2 dates that could compete for our founding dates. Lee's resolution was actually adopted in the early morning. For some reason, they took some of they met all night at sometimes, and made, like we believe, we don't know for sure, but we think the vote for independence was about 2 to 3 in the morning, and the acceptance of the Declaration on the 4th was between 2 and 3 in the morning. But on July 2nd, with 1 abstention, New York, because the colonies had decided that independence would not work if any single colony voted against it. So New York didn't vote against it, but it didn't receive clear instructions from its legislature, so it abstained. But at least it didn't prevent. So on July 2nd, the Continental Congress adopted Lee's Resolution of Independence. But then, for 2 more days, they debated Jefferson's Declaration. And from the time that Jefferson composed it to the time that it was adopted, there are over 400 changes in the document. Some of them trivial, some of them matters of taste and expression, 2 of them critical. One, Jefferson had included a resolution condemning slavery and blaming the importation of slavery to America on the king. The colonists from South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonists, required that to be excised, cut out, and it was. We'll talk more about that later. The other one was, of course, but this was a change that Jefferson, as you'll see, changed. He adopted the language of self-evident truth. More about that later. So on July 4th, around 2, 3 in the morning, the Declaration of Independence was accepted, and John Hancock, the president of the convention, in the early morning, about 8 or 9 in the morning, stepped out on what is today called Independence Hall. It was actually the state capitol of Pennsylvania, the State House, and the bell tower wasn't there yet, and read this declaration to the gathered citizens. And then it was quickly sent to the other state capitals and to George Washington, who in the field read it to his troops, and it had exactly the effect that they hoped it would. It became a rallying cry. So, to finish the history of the Revolutionary period, the third part of Lee's resolution, the formation of a Continental Union, was eventually a committee was formed in the Congress, chaired by John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, and they drafted the Articles of Confederation. A year later, by the way, in 1777, and those were sent out to the state capitals. And in 1781, there are 2 important dates. You should remember them, that you should remember for 1781. One, on March 1st, after all those years, the Articles of Confederation were officially ratified because it required unanimous ratification of all the states, as we'll see. So we actually didn't become a country, at least a self-governing institutional country, until long into the war. In fact, 1781 is also important because that was the end of the war. On October 19th, at the Battle of Yorktown, Lord Cornwallis, the commander-in-chief of British forces, surrendered to about 5,000 troops led by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, if you saw the play and the musical, and about 7,000 French troops in ships off the shore. So October 19th, 1781, the war is over, we won, and the last date, which you should remember, is 1783, when we negotiated the Treaty of Paris with Britain, and we became formally an independent nation. Now, and you'll see, this last date in this set of dates is the first one that we'll do when we talk about the formation of the Constitution. So if you're looking at the notes, let's turn now to the document itself and get a sense of its overall structure. This is the outline. Now, the original text of the Declaration isn't divided clearly into paragraphs. I've done that helpfully in the version I sent you. But there are 5 parts to the Declaration. Remember I said on Wednesday that the Declaration is a tightly arranged argument. And so let's look at the outline and in the notes, and let's see its structure and its content. The first paragraph is an introduction. When in the course of human events, etc. The organizing structure of the Roman numeral 1 of that paragraph, the ABC, are the 3 verbs. So the purpose of the introduction is to announce to the world what we are doing. What are we doing? We are dissolving. I'll quote the actual verbs. Remember, this is the first part of Lee's resolution. We're dissolving the political bonds with Britain. Second, we are assuming sovereignty. I talked about sovereignty on Wednesday, supreme authority. We're becoming an independent, sovereign, self-ruling nation. And by the way, let me just pump your curiosity. That second part, and by the way, to become a sovereign nation, the way Jefferson puts it is, we are assuming among the powers of the earth. Now listen very carefully to this language. The separate and equal status, the separate and independent status to which the laws of nature and nature's God, separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle us. we're going to come back to the language of separate and equal, uh, because that touches one of the core principles of the Declaration of Human Equality. But the powers of the earth, what Jefferson's referring to is the nations of the world. So that's just fancy, but not just fancy language. He's saying we're going to separate from our parent country and we're going to become a separate, independent, sovereign country, and assume among the sovereign, the independent, and equal nations of the world our sovereign status. And then we're going to declare a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Now, why is this important? It's not just enough to send it to the king and the parliament and disround. We understood, or I should say the people that drafted and adopted this document understood that its importance was not just to us as a nation or Britain, our parent country. They thought the American Revolution would have history-changing effects, and it did. And that its teachings, by the way, should be addressed to all of the world, not just to form alliances, which we do come back to, and that was the second part of Lee's resolution. But as you're going to see, if you assume that you're addressing America's declaration and its principles to the nation of the world, you would assume that the rest of the nations and the rest of humanity would understand those principles, perhaps. And you're going to see that has something to do with the language of self-evident truths. So that's what we're doing. The second part of the Declaration, its most important part, is what I call its theoretical core, or the principles that justify the action that we're taking. So these are the core principles. Let's just run through them. We'll explore them more thoroughly on Monday. First, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So human beings are equal. Second, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. People are equal. Human beings are equal. In what sense we'll talk about. They have rights. What are those rights? A right to life. They have a right to be alive. They have a right to be free. They have a right to pursue their happiness. And you're going to see Wilson talks about the Triad of Rights, which comes from Locke, life, liberty, and property, which, by the way, survives, as you'll see, in the Constitution in the 5th and 14th Amendments. And Wilson has an interesting discussion of why Jefferson substituted property or pursuit of happiness for property. It's not because Americans didn't believe in property and still don't. Private property is one of the core principles of the American political order. But Wilson has a nice discussion. The third great principle is that the purpose of government is to secure rights. Here's the language. We hold these truths that all they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So human beings invent or create government as a tool to secure their rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All legitimate power that government has is granted by the people over which government rules. The people, in other words, the people grant to government its power to rule. That's the doctrine of consent. And last, that governments may be altered or abolished when they become destructive of those rights. Human beings are equal. They have rights. The purpose of government is to secure rights. Government derives its power from the creators of government, the people. And when government ceases to perform its core function to secure those rights, when it becomes destructive of those rights, then the people have a right to alter or abolish. Now, by the way, the reason I call this also not only just the core truths of American life, but also the justifying principles of the revolution, because the Brits, of course, the British saw our actions as rebellion, illegal and immoral rebellion. We were rebelling against our divinely appointed king. But if it turns out that what we believe in is not divinely appointed British, the right of kings, the divine right of kings, but rather that every human being has a right to rule himself or herself, by the way, and that people have a right to form their own government when they don't think their existing government works, then you need these principles to justify the revolution. Otherwise, we're just naughty Britons rebelling against our divinely appointed ruler. But these principles say the king is not our divinely appointed ruler. We appointed him, the people did, and now he's misruling. And by the way, that leads to the third and the longest part of the Declaration, the charges against the king. Remember, this is an argument. we state what we're going to do, we state the principles that justify our actions, and then we state the facts. In fact, the last part of the second paragraph leads to this, a long train of abuses. And by the way, note that the main villain in the Declaration is the king. But the revolutionary struggle started when Parliament passed the Stamp Act. So, but you'll see, the Declaration takes a whack at Parliament and more. So the king's the main villain, and that long list of abuses. I just want to quickly go over this because we have about 5 minutes left in this lecture. So it's interesting. These charges are kind of grouped according to what emerges as the separation of powers. He has messed with our legislatures and our power to create laws for ourselves and pass bad laws. Legislative abuse. He's disturbed our courts and made laws that undermine the administration of justice. Judicial abuse. He has appointed officers to oppress us. Administrative or executive abuse. Legislative, executive, judicial. And last, he has ravaged our coasts and burned our cities and killed our population. Nobody would say those are the actions of an efficient or good government. In other words, not only has he disturbed the functions of government, legislative, executive, judicial, he's actually now declared war on us. He is coming after us. And therefore, this third part has a conclusion. Such a prince is a tyrant and unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So the conclusion of this section is the king is a tyrant. Now, the fourth part, it says that's just not the king, nor have we been wanting in attention. And you might want to look up the word consanguinity, common blood, by the way. And it turns out that both Parliament and the British people have been complicit in our oppression. So this isn't just a rejection of the king's authority. This part is also necessary to justify the first action in the first paragraph, dissolving the political and cultural bonds, not just like becoming a different province like Canada of Great Britain, which before it became an independent nation, it was a province. But not, because it's not just the king, but the Parliament and the British people who should have come to our defense, our British brethren, but they didn't, our British brothers. So we have to separate not only from the king, not only from the Parliament, but there has to be a new nation, a new people, different from the British people. And the last part of the Declaration is the fulfillment of Lee's resolution. Therefore, they repeat the separation. They repeat assuming sovereignty, the second of the verbs in the first section, and they give a little spin on it. What does that mean? It means the power to declare war and peace, to conduct commerce and alliances, that alliance with horns. And they commit as delegates their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they paid the price, by the way. Many of the men that signed this document eventually, when it was in parchment on August 8th, it was printed, by the way, on the next day, and that's what was sent throughout the colonies, and that's what John Hancock read, the printed version. That first printed copy, by the way, is available in the Museum of the Bicentennial in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, just down from Independence Hall. Now, I only have 3 minutes or so. We'll pick this issue up on Monday, because this is we're not going to fully finish this lecture, get used to it, but I do want to set it up anyway. Remember I said Jefferson wrote a rough draft, and then he revised it, and one of his first main changes, let me read the original draft that Jefferson wrote. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, this is in Roman numeral 3 on the notes, and to assume among the powers of the earth, you can see this is a rough draft, it improved, the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the change. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. First, Jefferson describes the things that we affirm as Americans, our ideas, as sacred and undeniable. Now, that language comes from religion. It's like a creedal statement, like the 3 kinds of Christian creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. A creedal statement coming from credo, to believe. So, in other words, what would make them true is because we hold them to be true, like any other religious belief. But then Jefferson changed that designation to self-evident. So we're not going to finish that point today. We'll begin with this on Monday. And so what you should then do is, what does a self-evident truth mean? Read Hamilton's statement. Read the email I sent about 2 plus 2 equals 4, and negative b plus and minus b squared, the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 4c. Hamilton says that a self-evident truth first comes from the field of geometry or mathematics. So as you're going to see, and this is my last thought, Jefferson and the founders, the drafters, thought that the principles that make America what it is aren't just the creedal statements of a group of human beings, but rather self-evident truths, as true as a mathematical statement. We'll see what self-evident means, but again, you'll see that this points to the first great core set of beliefs of the Declaration, a doctrine about nature, because it is nature that ultimately is the standard of authority for the Declaration. Yes, in the first part, Jefferson says the laws of nature and nature's God. And so we'll begin with this great question on Monday. Is the Declaration a religious document? Does it require religious belief? And is it a Christian document? Controversial questions, but critical questions, and ones worth thinking about profoundly. And we'll do that on Monday.